Sidi ran to Seri, frightened by the storm and the heavy banging on the door. Followed by Asteria, the three of them went to the back of the hut and turned over the bed to take cover and protect the child. Helga, Cullen, and Harolf approached the door with their weapons drawn. The old woman warned everyone to be ready for a fight as Cullen opened the door. The figure before them looked at first like a lost raider in bad shape. But as it stared at them with unnatural blue glowing eyes, they realized that its body was decomposed, with pieces of flesh and bones missing. The undead lifted its axe toward Cullen and Asteria, jamming an arrow into its shoulder to drive it back. It recoiled but seemed unfazed by the attack. The battle began, and the melee fighters used all their strength to destroy the undead. As Cullen pierced its rotting flesh and Harolf struck it, they noticed that the creature was not bleeding. Only a small amount of thick black ooze was oozing from its body. Helga was stunned at first, muttering to herself, wondering how such an abomination could exist. But she joined the fight, wielding her axe. She blessed her weapon, which glowed with radiant power, and sliced through the undead's belly. For the first time, the creature grunted in pain. As the group in the rear focused on the undead in front of them, Seri heard muffled sounds coming from the back of the hut. Suddenly, the boards covering a window were pushed aside, and another undead emerged. Seri covered Sidi's eyes, and together with Asteria, they jumped to the other side of the bed to hide. Asteria shouted to the others that another one was entering the hut from the back. Meanwhile, the undead at the front door had wounded Helga badly. She looked at the wounds caused by this abomination and prayed to Aldin to bless her companions with divine magic. As the second undead approached them, Sarai ran to a table to grab an axe and threw it at the monster, taunting it and drawing its attention away from Sidi. Asteria took the opportunity to grab Sidi's hand and move closer to the others. She noticed that the undead attacking Seri wore the symbol of the War Clan. For the first time, the little girl could see what was happening. She saw the two undead, and Helga covered in blood. She gasped in fear, and Asteria covered her mouth in time. She pointed to a closet and ordered Sidi to hide. The girl nodded and hid in the cupboard. Asteria looked at the undead that was hurting Helga, whispered something, and could see the monster's weaknesses. She hit it with an arrow and wounded it badly. Unfortunately, that was not enough, and the undead hit poor Helga again, who collapsed to the ground. Furious, Cullen used his spear and managed to cut off the head. The body stopped moving for a second, but to everyone's horror, it searched for its head and magically reattached it to its body. Meanwhile, the second undead attacked Seri, who ran away coughing blood. The group recklessly attacked the undead at the front door until Cullen was able to deliver the fatal blow, splitting its body with his spear. The monster looked at him, its glowing blue eyes fading as it finally appeared, lifeless. Harolf used his medicinal herbs and revived the old woman, asking for her help. They ran to Seri's aid. Helga cast a spell and summoned crows to attack the last undead, but he made them vanish, seemingly unfazed. Seri grabbed her two daggers, plunged them into the monster's feet to immobilize it, and ran to the others. Everyone's attention was on the last undead. Seri, barely standing, sat down at the table and used it to aim her crossbow at the monster. Asteria ran to her and fed the tiefling some good berries to restore her energy. She then helped the others fight the undead, and with everyone's efforts, the monster finally collapsed to the ground. Helga dismembered it completely with her axe, slashing frenetically to make sure it would never rise again. The storm was still raging outside, and they had to barricade the hut again to protect themselves from the biting wind. Asteria pointed to the mark of the War Clan on the undead, and they all wondered what they were doing here. Cullen dragged the bodies outside, smelling the distinct scent of the sea on them. Helga expressed her curiosity as to why the war would worship hell. Asteria tried to explain that the War Clan had different views of hell. Most of them believed that hell would protect them from death, as if they were better than the others. Anger could be seen in Asteria's eyes. Cullen gathered unrotten wood that was still lying around the hut and used the stove to warm the group. Asteria borrowed a dagger from Siri and taught Sidi how to use it. She felt she had to learn how to fight, or at least defend herself. She took ashes from the stove and drew circles on the wall, asking the child to aim at them. A few hours later, the storm had finally stopped. Cullen and Asteria went outside, and the latter could see some light in the distance. Cullen unhooked the lantern and took it with him to examine it. Unlike normal lanterns, he could not open it, and there was no way to remove the light. Inside the hut, Helga was talking to Seri about the gods and Seri's home. Herolf joined the conversation when the old woman asked him to tell her about his adventures and raids. Later that evening, Herolf suggested that they build a bonfire and burn the corpses. As they gathered them, Asteria noticed that none of them had toenails or fingernails, but no one could think of a logical explanation. One thing was certain: if these people had returned from the underworld, they had not died in battle. Herolf looked at the burned bodies and said a prayer. "O great Hel, ruler of the underworld, Lady of Death, take these souls back to your realm. Bring them back to your kingdom. Show them eternal rest so that they will not rise again. O great Hel, spare us on our journey through these lands. Show us mercy, and keep your minions at bay." Meanwhile, Seri took care of Sidi in the hut. She offered her the small spear she had made, telling her it would bring her luck. She then taught the child how to hide better in the future. Eventually, the sun came up, and they resumed their journey. It took only another day to reach the edge of a forest that paralleled the tributary of the river. The trees were diverse and sparse. There was no sign of further north beyond the river. After a few hours of walking, the group reached the river they had seen from the outpost. The river seemed calm and quiet. Seri recognized the place and knew that the only way to get to nowhere was to cross the river. She also informed the group that the river was not as calm as it looked, and that it was quite dangerous to try to cross it without any preparation. They also spotted 2 pairs of reptilian eyes in the water. They discussed ideas for a moment and came up with a plan. They would build a raft to cross the river together, and Asteria would hunt an animal, hoping that its blood would attract the reptiles and allow them to cross the river without a fight. The half-elf went alone and set a trap, using the same method she had used for the rabbit a few nights before. A fox appeared and was caught in the trap. She quickly put it out of its misery and thanked it before rejoining the others. Herolf and Cullen were actively working on the raft, and Helga prayed to Alden for guidance. The old woman suggested they swim instead, but Herolf convinced her otherwise, and she eventually helped them. Seri was with Sidi and looked for a good place to cross the river, but to no avail. Finally, Asteria and Helga took one last look at the raft, which seemed sturdy enough to be used. Asteria threw the fox into the river as bait, making it bleed, and when the reptilian eyes followed the trail of blood in the water, the group used it as an opportunity to jump on the raft and leave. Helga used her axe to steer the boat, and the group crossed the river without a hitch. They continued on foot, eventually stopping for the day as night slowly descended. They performed their camp ritual, with Asteria once again training Sidi in the use of a dagger. While the child was practicing, Asteria looked out into the forest and turned very pale, as if she'd just seen a ghost. In the distance, a pair of eyes she recognized watched her. She approached them slowly and the creature disappeared. She ran to where it had been, and her heart skipped a beat when she noticed tracks. "It can't be," she muttered to herself, shaking. When she heard Sidi approaching, she quickly erased the tracks and pretended that she thought she saw something. They returned to the camp, but Asteria's eyes were fixed on the forest. Herolf and Helga both noticed and inquired about it, but Asteria remained vague, explaining that she thought she saw a ghost. Helga nodded and replied that it sometimes helped her to keep her sanity, while Asteria replied that on the contrary, seeing ghosts drove her crazy. Suddenly they heard a gasp of delight from Cullen. He had been studying the lead bottles for the past 2 evenings and finally realized that they contained ink. His lips turned black as he tasted it. Herolf and Sidi chuckled, while Asteria looked at the forest again, wondering if she would see the creature again. The night passed without incident, and they left early. Seri was sure they were not far from nowhere. After a few hours, nowhere finally stood before them. Smoke billowed from dozens of wooden houses clustered on the north and south sides of the river. A dirt road, worn by generations of boots crushing the sharp lava rock, snaked through the city. Half a dozen longships, most flying unrecognizable flags, crowded the docks in the center of town, surrounded by numerous smaller vessels. Children and adults meandered through the rocky streets. Dwarves, elves, a variety of dragonborn, and others walked among the humans. But none seemed as out of place as a woman with curling horns, pale red skin, and pointed teeth on the outskirts of town. She crouched in front of a hide lean-to, a small campfire burning. She stared at the group with golden eyes, but did not rise to greet them, instead concentrating on dropping something into the flames. The tiefling locked eyes with Sari and asked why she had all her fingernails. The tiefling, called Egil, had a vision of a ship made of fingernails and toenails in Ragnarok, and wanted to prevent this from happening by cutting everyone's nails and burning them. They politely declined her offer and went to the clearing where the seer was supposed to be. They walked past the docks. Along the eastern half were numerous docks with longships tied down to keep them from slipping downstream. A thin, short elf barked at a mixed crowd of humans, elves, gnomes, and half-orcs working along the waterfront. Though not exactly a bustling port, it seemed to keep these workers busy enough. They continued on and encountered a large crowd of drunks who had accidentally poured mead on Cullen. A woman held out a drinking horn filled with mead to Cullen, who took it, cheered, and drank greedily. The woman looked happy and followed the rest of the drunkards. At one point, Sari wanted to leave the group, claiming that she needed to speak to an old friend, but the group insisted that she stay with them until they all saw the seer, that she could see the friend afterward. Near the clearing, the smell of wood and tar was strong as the group approached a large outdoor workshop with a small house behind it. Most of the yard was reserved for sawhorses, stacks of lumber, and several storage sheds. 2 longship skeletons awaited completion. A third longship, nearly complete, rested on sawhorses near where the river curved into the yard. Only the bow and some finishing work remained before it would be waterworthy. Finally, they reached the grove. A small grove of trees surrounded a clearing near the river. A campfire was burning near a pile of wood, and a tall man stood on the opposite side of the fire. As the group approached, they noticed that this individual was made of blue-black wood and stood nearly 10 feet tall, his arms poking through the white tunic he wore, as thin as twigs. He raised those arms as if in greeting, and they brushed the drooping branches of the snow-covered trees, spraying snow everywhere, the fire hissing where it bit cold flakes. He smiled, his wooden features widening into a broad grin. "Friend, you came back, and you brought others. Good, good. Now show me your birth runes, and I will show you how this world of ours could end." He was a wicker and introduced himself as Knikan. He greeted Sari and wanted to hug her, but the tiefling avoided him. Sari said with a bit of anger that she should find answers in the tower, but that there was nothing there but more mouths to feed. Knikan politely replied that Sari had found answers in the tower, looking at the others, and locked eyes with CD. The girl clung to Sari, frightened by the 3-meter wicker. He first looked at Helga and asked to see her tattooed rune. As he examined it, he could feel the curse she was under. Hearing the word curse, Asteria came closer, and Knikan asked to see her tattooed rune. He could feel great pain. She asked about her own curse, but Knikan was surprised and replied that he saw no curse. Asteria was in shock. She whispered to herself that there was no curse, as if she could not believe what the old wicker had just told her. Knikan turned to Cullen and saw that he had to stay alive. As the last descendant of the Dana clan, his powers would be needed for Ragnarok. Knikan looked at Sari and added that he had already seen her tattooed runes. Finally, his gaze fell on Sidi, who was still terrified of the giant. He said that she had a great destiny to fulfill and that it would eventually be revealed. Then he took a piece of black cloth and prepared a ritual.